First it was Volkswagen, now Mitsubishi owns up to falsifying its data, this time on fuel efficiency. Japan's government is investigating, but can consumers around the world trust the car industry? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Wednesday was a bad day for car makers. Japanese manufacturer Mitsubishi was forced to apologise after confessing it had exaggerated the fuel economy of more than 600,000 cars. Government officials later raided one of its offices and research facilities, forcing the company's share price to drop to an all-time low. And of course, it's not just Mitsubishi. On the same day, Volkswagen reached an agreement in the US to compensate 500,000 American owners of its diesel-powered cars. And what some are calling an international pattern of cheating in the car industry, the German car maker was found to be falsifying its emissions data. Before we bring in our guests, Harry Fawcett has this report from Fukuoka in southern Japan.
Well, owners of some 625,000 vehicles, Mitsubishis and Nissans among them, because Mitsubishi made some of these cars for Nissan, they're having to contend with the idea that their cars aren't quite, at least, as fuel efficient as they were told. This is a major scandal for Mitsubishi, and it's far from over yet. This company had been rebounding, had been trying to recover from major scandals of the early 2000s about cover-ups of recalls and defects with their vehicles. The president of the company as good as admitting that the company had breached consumers' trust once again.
Mitsubishi just doesn't lie anything. They had this kind of scandal before. I wonder if they truly regret what happened last time.
Well, throughout the morning we've seen a pretty steady stream of the Mitsubishi models involved being brought back here to this service center by employees. Those two models, along with the two Nissan models, have been taken off sale entirely. Their production stopped. The company stands to take a pretty big hit on all of this. Potential compensation to individual customers, to the Nissan Motor Company, as well potential penalties to be paid to the Japanese government. But it could be that the situation gets worse for Mitsubishi. It says it's been using this test, which is at least open to this kind of abuse, since 2002. It's testing other models to see if their results were also falsified. 8 models' results are due back by next week. And so they also say that there could be models that have been sold overseas. They just don't know at this stage. These revelations, as bad as they are, as damaging as they've been, could just be the start.
Well, let's bring our guests into the show then. We have joining us in London, Nick Molden, Chief Executive of Emissions Analytics. In Berlin, Felix Stoeckle, a partner at the marketing consultancy firm Profit. And also in London, Annalisa Kerr, a global futurist who's worked with some of the world's leading brands. Welcome to all of you. If I could start with Nick, can customers trust automakers anymore?
Well, it's certainly true that trust has been really eroded recently in the light of the Dieselgate Volkswagen scandal. But I think what's striking is that these are competitive markets where auto manufacturers are looking for a level playing field from the regulations, and in a way it's the regulations that have let down the situation, where they're not well formed and there's lots of laxities in them, which then has bred an industry of different manufacturers having incentives to try and exploit these laxities in the system. But
hang on, Nick, just because regulations may not be perfect, that's not an excuse for manufacturers to cheat or lie to consumers, is it? There's maybe something wrong with regulations. There's something wrong with companies, isn't there?
Well, I think we have to be clear, with the Dieselgate scandal, it's not yet established whether anyone has done anything illegal in Europe at all. It's clear that VW has done an illegal thing in the US, but not necessarily in Europe. So we're going to get to a debate about whether companies must abide by the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law.
Interesting. Felix, you know, a lot of people are asking if this can happen, these sorts of problems can happen with so-called champions of corporate social responsibility, companies that, you know, really touted those credentials. Who can consumers trust anymore?
Well, I think obviously this whole crisis is eating up a lot of trust. There was a really interesting research we did a week into the Volkswagen crisis. So we asked German consumers about their opinion, and it was really interesting because at the time 91% said Volkswagen won't be the only ones, and obviously they have been right. And also they said they still trust Volkswagen to build great cars, and they would even buy a Volkswagen in the future if it would be a good offer. And so very early into this crisis, obviously not much trust of that brand equity that Volkswagen built throughout the 100 years it exists with the Beetle and the bus and everything was eaten up. But obviously a crisis like that is not something static. It's moving on, and I think if we would do the same research today, we would get a different picture. So
what do you think would be different
this
today?
is really eating up trust. I think that the way that Volkswagen handled it, all the communications and the differences they made between different markets in terms of compensation, how they managed getting the cars back into the workshop, stuff like that. I think that add up a lot of trust on top of it. And so I think the picture will be different today.
Well, let's turn now to the lady with the crystal ball. You're going to look into the future for us, and we can do so by starting perhaps with a little look behind Annalisa. Volkswagen, of course, was accused by the US Environmental Protection Agency in July 1973 of installing defeat devices in its cars. Here we are again talking about the same sort of issue. Mitsubishi, as well as other makers, have had trust issues in the past before, which makes you wonder, is trust becoming a thing of the past when it comes to the auto industry? Is this just the standard operating procedure we'll have to put up with even going forward?
Well, we're looking at a completely paradigm shift, and I'm afraid I have to disappoint you. I do not have a crystal ball. But as a futurist, of course, we look to the past and the present in order to see for traces. Trust has been very low since the first sort of, in the beginning of this millennium. When we look back, still car sales are going up, but there has been that sort of bumpy journey of trust. If you look at the Meaningful Brand Index, which is published by Harvard Media, they see on a global level that only 1 in 5 brands globally are seen as having a meaningful impact on people's life. And if you ask consumers in the UK or the US, they wouldn't care if 93% of brands were disappearing. So what I think and what I feel when I speak to organizations is simply that, trust has to be rebuilt. And of course, reputation management. Trust is our most important currency, and if we keep, trying to jump corners and doing things that are seen as dishonest, we will eventually just not, as consumers, trust those brands anymore. So when you look at Edelman's trust barometer, some of the most trusted brands are from the health sector and IT. Automotive is 8, and I think the financial services is on 12. So again, certain sectors have very little trust from the consumers.
Well, Mitsubishi is just the latest car manufacturer, of course, to be exposed for lying to customers, as it's accused. In September, the US Environmental Protection Agency proved that some 600,000 Volkswagen cars included software that purposely cheated on emissions tests. Some VW models were pumping out up to 40 times more than the legal limit of the pollutant nitrogen oxide. In 2014, South Korean car makers Kia and Hyundai paid $350 million in penalties for overstating their fuel economy figures. And that same year, Ford paid thousands in reparations for selling cars with inflated mileage ratings. Nick, how widespread is cheating in the auto industry then?
I think there's a very different pattern between the US and Europe. In the US, it tends to be occasional isolated incidents which typically get caught and punished. In Europe, everyone is operating to optimize within the system, which leads to big differences between official figures and real world performance. But that is operating in that line between the spirit and the letter of the law that I was talking about earlier. And quite probably all of those are actually not doing anything illegal. I mean, what I think is what consumers really want is to know the truth. They're not interested in the ins and outs of the regulations. They want to know the truth. And that's why I set up emissions analytics, to do independent, real on-road testing, to be able to tell consumers what fuel economy in miles per gallon they should be able to get from their vehicle, and what the true level of nitrogen oxide emissions should be as well. And that's what we've launched in a NOx rating scheme called an EQA Air Quality Index, just to put it into the consumer's hands, to tell them, right, this is the real emissions that are being put out by that car, and in that way, hopefully, can build trust in the marketplace again. I think it requires that sort of independent voice rather than over-reliance on the official regulatory system. That's really the cul-de-sac we've gone down.
System that independent voice? Annalisa, why do we have this sort of dual system allowed to exist, at least in Europe, as Nick is saying, between what the manufacturers are allowed to say and what the real world figures show?
Well, you just have to show, start with the COP15, where it was in Copenhagen. I'm a Copenhagen Goodwill Ambassador. And really the challenge is to get, different nations to speak with a more united and unified voice. It isn't possible. So I think it's something that has to be in the DNA of a culture as well. For example, as a Nordic, I'm Danish, Swedish, I'm married to Norwegian, I work in Finland, I've just come back from Iceland. And hey, it is a very, very different story up there. Everybody are very much into the total transparency. There's nowhere to hide. They even publish your salary on the internet or in the newspaper. And when you look to Denmark, for example, also trust is up very high. I think it's the less corrupt society in the whole wide world. I think it comes 94. It's basically it's only 6% compared. I mean, in the OECD, it's the least corrupt nation in the whole wide world. So there's something in that part of the world where it's just by default. And if you're not part of your culture and you can get away with cheating, I think a lot will say, okay, why don't we just do it? Or it is maybe about presenting good news to the stakeholders, the shareholders. So there are many different layers. It isn't just an easy one, really. It's a very complex landscape to navigate. But I guess we can learn from that if we look at the capital P in leadership and the companies being led by CEOs. We are seeing a trend towards the capital P in leadership will be purpose. And this is not about being the best in the world, but more being the best for the world. And we see really that paradigm shift out there. So there's not just one P on the bottom line for profit, but it's more 4P bottom line, where people, planet, purpose, and profit has to balance. But it's early days, I can tell you.
It is early days, and we've got Felix with us. I wanted to bring Felix into this discussion because Annalisa put her finger there on some of the pressures that companies are under to meet the bottom line expectations of investors and so on. When marketing and PR gurus advise automakers, I mean, what do you advise them to do in how they position and advertise their vehicles? Are you advising them to go with real-world figures, to go with a little more, shall we say, Scandinavian transparency, or to simply try and weave whatever they can get away with that fits the regulations?
No, I think I agree with Annalisa on this. So first of all, we are moving to an age of total transparency. And so it doesn't make sense to hide in any kind of way, because at some point those things will be uncovered. And I agree with her as well that I think this is a leadership crisis in the end. Yeah, it's about how companies are managed, and certainly there are lots of constraints from different stakeholders, but I mean, if you look at what's happening there, I think that the trust is eaten up by culture, by a misled leadership culture. I think we all knew before that the consumption of cars, the way it's measured, I would say in the customer experience, it is what we call a pain point. Yeah, so when you buy the car, you knew that it might consume 20% more, stuff like that. And I think what was also interesting, and that's part of the research we did, is people don't believe a Volkswagen or now a Mitsubishi is a bad car as such. It was manipulated, but the product as a whole still they believe is a good product. Yeah?
Then Felix, I mean, do you agree with Nick's point that perhaps the
by
regulations,
the culture and how they behave?
Do regulations need to change so that automakers are no longer allowed to put out figures that reflect some sort of ideal lab conditions that don't exist in the real world? Because as you said, when we go and buy a car, I mean, it's not
Absolutely.
a surprise that your fuel economy figures, the emissions levels, even the acceleration and braking distances, all of those stuffs you take with a pinch of salt, don't you?
Exactly, and so I think one of these questions was about, is technology moving too fast for legislation? And
that's a good point.
I think you could also ask it the other way around: is legislation too fast for technology? Yeah, so. You could argue that all these companies had enough time to adopt and adjust to, let's say, the regulatory, the CO2 emissions and so going up.
Okay.
But I think they cheated because they couldn't meet those standards. And so there's something wrong in that system. I would say both ends. Yeah, and I would say
Nick wants to say something.
It needs to be solved, and it needs to be really transparent.
All right, Nick and Annalisa want to say something. Let me give Nick a chance, and then we'll come to you in a minute, if that's all right, Annalisa. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, this throws up some really interesting policy questions, even beyond good regulation. Because in the case of vehicles, in many respects, you have the carbon dioxide and the nitrogen oxides trading off against one another. So you can get the CO2 down, but that may be at the price of the NOx being higher, or vice versa. So where do you want to be on that trade-off? And I think a lot of the issues we're facing now with over-emissions of NOx were laid 10, 15 years ago, when there was a big push in Europe for reducing CO2 for climate change reasons, and the NOx emissions and air quality was very much downplayed, and that was a high-level political big picture question. Now, actually, it's not objective that one, whether CO2 is better than NOx, and which is worse and which needs to be reduced more actively. So the question is, how's that resolved through the political process in deciding which one is more important, even before you get to then what is an effective regulation to bring about that policy?
All right, so some broader policy questions need to be settled. Annalisa wanted to weigh in. Go ahead.
Well, as a futurist, and we sort of engage heavily in trend management, we don't just look at the socio-economic drivers, we also look at the emotional and sort of more ethical drivers. So when you look at the bigger system, I think there are 2 or 3 things here at stake. First of all, the automotive industry is about to be disrupted. We just look at the Netherlands, are looking to pass a law that by 2025, I think it is, they're going to ban petrol and diesel cars. So that means all electrical cars. So it's still to see whether it will be passed, but that's a very interesting one. Apple will be bringing out a car. We have Tesla. We have some of the big players on the industry. The industry is being disrupted as we talk. So it's much bigger. It's a much bigger ecosystem than just legislation. Because again, when you look at other, car manufacturers, they're looking to bring out the same cars but with different specs, so they can both be electrical but also in fuel. But eventually we will see that the electrical car will be the new norm.
So Annalisa, you're not worried about technology. The thought that comes to some people's mind is, has technology simply got too smart for us? The car is such a complex thing. There's no way most people can know whether this car has got some defeat device software that knows when to switch itself on and off and how to cheat. I mean, are you worried about technology perhaps getting a little ahead of us?
No, not at all. I think if you don't have anything to hide and you really try to work to the latest insights and the best practice in the business, you will always be ahead. And I think Tesla is a very interesting example of that. I worked with Toyota back in 2003 on a major project for 2025. And we kept saying to them, push cars that have a low impact on the environment. And that's one of the things that they pride themselves in, to have the lowest emission impact, et cetera, et cetera. So we just see there are people out there that sets trends that are more led by purpose. I mean, of course, profit always is a key, but it needs to be part of a wider ecosystem in order to build trust, in order to really bring about products and services that has meaning and adds meaning. And really, I would rather be in a car that's self-driven. I can go to a party. I don't have to worry about getting a glass too many. I can don't have to be stressed. I can work in my car. So I think we're just looking at a complete disruptor. We don't need drivers. We can, we don't need to put petrol in our cars. So we're just seeing really now the early signs of disruption.
All right, so the world's
Big
changing and the auto industry disrupting in some parts of the world. But Felix, will standards rise and the sort of changes that Annelies is talking about, can we expect that equally around the world? I mean, even if we look at the latest cases and we ask the question, how much recall has there been by Volkswagen in developing countries? How many cars do we know have been affected by the latest Mitsubishi problem and scandal in the developing world or even outside of Japan? There are still some black holes in some parts of the world and different levels, aren't there, Felix?
Yeah, I think you're right, there are, but I think that things will grow together much faster than what we have seen in the past. And again, I agree with Annelies that this is not a technology issue, because after all, it was human beings who applied that technology, let's say, in a wrong way. And I think if you look at the bigger picture, probably as the industry is disrupted, as Google, Tesla, Uber and so on get into the game, it's potentially the worst moment in time, losing trust with customers, where you're basically challenged from all sides in terms of staying relevant, producing the right products for the future, and giving customers what they really need. And we did some research recently around banks. And one of the key outcomes was that people said, I want my bank to offer the services that fintechs create right now, because I don't know those companies. I don't want to give them my money. So I think there's a huge opportunity for incumbent companies in the automotive industry to drive that change. And we see how Google and Apple and so on are struggling to really get the final product out of the door, and this is really the worst moment in time to lose that customer or consumer trust.
Okay, very briefly, we've got a minute. Nick, we're putting a lot of faith here at the end of the show in technology and things improving in the future. Is that enough technology if regulators in some cases are not looking hard enough, and companies like human beings often have an incentive to try and cheat and maximize the bottom line?
Well, yeah, I have two big concerns. One is around that and an asymmetry in the regulations, that as technology becomes more complicated, regulations almost have to become more complicated to regulate those more complicated vehicles. And you find that actually the manufacturers have more expertise than the regulators. And so there's always the danger that the regulators are outgunned by the expertise on the side of the manufacturers. The other concern I have comes down to economics. I mean, it is technologically possible to solve a lot of our air quality problems and other emissions problems, but at what cost? From an economic point of view, transportation, motoring needs to be kept at a viable price for the mass market, otherwise it'll have knock-on implications for economic and social welfare.
Right, all right, a bit of realism at the end there. We have to perhaps then end the show now. Lots more to talk about. I'm sure we'll be back talking about this again in the not too distant future. Let's thank our guests, Nick Molden, Felix Stoeckle and Annelies Kerr. Thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, our handle there, @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team, for now, it's goodbye.